Hello, welcome back to MidEast In-Depth. Today we will be looking at varied views on media coverage of what is happening in Gaza. Raphael Ahren, diplomatic correspondent of the Times of Israel, writes an opinion piece titled "As Gaza Death Mounts, UK Media Leads World Trend to Criticize Israel." Ahren also observes German TV hosts introduced reports on Operation Protective Edge with facial expressions, quote, outright hateful to Israel. Ahren says international media focused heavily on the rising Palestinian death toll and the prospect of further Israeli air raids on Gaza over the weekend, with reporters demoting coverage of indiscriminate rocket fire on Israeli civilians to the end of their stories when it was mentioned at all. British media is particularly critical, he says, of Israel, referring to the British ITV News television channel, which on Sunday reported Israel bombs civilian targets with links to Hamas, and an article headlined, "Israel has ignored international appeals for a ceasefire and widened its range of Gaza bomb targets to include civilian institutions with suspected Hamas ties." And The Guardian, a London-based paper traditionally critical of Israel, he says, had 3 items on Operation Protective Edge on its homepage. The Guardian headlines, "Israeli troops in Gaza clash as residents told to evacuate, disabled Gazans unable to escape." Ahren then looks at the media in Germany. The country's largest news site, Spiegel Online, ran a prominently placed piece that reported extensively on international criticism of Protective Edge rockets launched in Israel's direction, were briefly mentioned in the 5th paragraph. Ahren also looks at French media complaining about the same thing through articles in Le Figaro and Le Monde. He then goes to the US, suggesting that the New York Times highlights damage on the Palestinian side mostly. He adds, there is a bias within the American press. There is a bias against Israel. It's more a bias that requires Israel to hold itself to a higher standard because Israel claims to. A journalist and activist, Ameena Salem, working closely with Palestine's Solidarity Campaign in the UK, writes a piece in the Intifada Online titled "Brian Eno Joins Criticism of BBC's Bias Against Palestinians." Salem looks at the musician Brian Eno, who was the former BBC Middle East correspondent, who is among the public figures who have condemned the BBC in recent days for lack of impartiality in reporting Israel's assault on Gaza and the West Bank, and for valuing Israeli lives above those of Palestinians. There have been large public protests outside several BBC facilities, and more are planned in coming days. The BBC's reputation for impartiality is being eroded. It's a drift I started to notice a few years ago, and which I think has become very obvious, Eno said. The former BBC correspondent says it is not just in its recent coverage that the BBC completely fails to reflect the imbalance between what it terms the two sides, Israel and the Palestinians. BBC has not informed its audiences that Israel, as the occupying power in Gaza, has held the 1.8 million people there under strangling siege for the last 7 years. According to Eno, the media presents the occupation as a conflict or even a war. In its coverage of the West Bank, the BBC has taken to using the term sectarian tensions to hide the reality that what is taking place is illegal occupation and colonization. Ameena Salem says the result, of course, is to convey a completely false picture that there are 2 groups fighting each other who are both under equal threat. And now we are joined by William Spring, British political commentator. Welcome on MidEast In-Depth.
Yes, pleased to be with you.
What do you think of all the protests against the BBC in Glasgow and Manchester, claiming that the BBC presents what is happening in Gaza in a biased way?
Well, the basic problem is the BBC presents virtually everything in a biased way. There is a BBC position on the world, and that applies to virtually every issue. Now, on Gaza and the Middle East, Palestine, the BBC has always stuck to the view that it's a purely internal affair of the Israeli government. The BBC employees and the BBC political commentators, with the exception of Jeremy Bowen, generally feel that however many people are killed in Gaza, it's no business of the British people. When we tried to have an appeal for aid to Gaza after the last butchery session of the Israeli military several years ago, the BBC refused to allow the appeal. The BBC management and the Board of Trustees are totally oblivious to humane considerations. Mm-hmm. And the same is true, I'm afraid, of the British government. I mean, Mr. Haig says that what goes on in Gaza is purely defensive action by the Israelis against terrorism, as he calls it. Now, this is absurd. Of course, it's genocide that's going on in Gaza, mm-hmm. because to try and destroy a people, even if you don't actually want to destroy every single person who is an Arab, but to seek to destroy, to obliterate, to eliminate from the face of the earth all the people who live in Gaza, which is the position of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Force. Yes. It's the position of Mr. Netanyahu. He doesn't want a single Arab living in either in Gaza or probably anywhere else in the Middle East, unless that Arab is completely programmed like some sort of robot to act in accord with the wishes of the Zionist minority. Mm-hmm. That's the problem, and they are determined on this business, if you like, of industrial killing of Palestinians in Gaza, and they will not be satisfied until Gaza is completely derelict, emptied of people, mm-hmm. And the people have either fled, which is probably what they prefer, or are dead.
Mm. Let me clarify, of course, that these are your opinions. Mr. Spring, meanwhile, Raphael Ahren, diplomatic correspondent of the Times of Israel, writes an article titled "UK Media Leads the World Trend to Criticize Israel," complaining about the media here in the UK.
Well, I can't see what... I mean, with friends like these, who needs enemies? I mean, the media in the UK are the most controlled media in the Western world. They generally say what the government says, and you've also got the problem of Rupert Murdoch and News Group, because on the one hand you've got the BBC, which actually is officially the government channel. They claim to be an independent channel, but they're not. In no way are they independent. The BBC only spouts the government line, but then they're joined by Sky News and by the News Group.
But now, he refers to the Guardian. He refers to the Guardian looking at casualties falling on the Palestinian side without putting so much emphasis on the Israeli casualties. That's what he's complaining about. Well,
I think the problem is that there are obviously casualties in Israel, and no one denies that. The question is, does Mr. Netanyahu really want the rockets from Gaza to stop? Mm-hmm. Well, if he does, then he will stop his military bombardment of Gaza. Mm-hmm. Because I'm quite sure if the Israelis stopped now their attack on Gaza, then the Hamas, whoever they are, who are firing rockets from Gaza, will also stop. Mm-hmm. The pressure on them would be enormous to stop, and they would stop. Mm-hmm. So the Israelis are keeping this one-sided war going, and I don't call it a war because these missiles that Hamas is firing up, or supposedly Hamas, I'm not saying who it is, but they are really, by comparison with the Israeli ordnance, artillery and missiles, just squibs, as we used to call our very small fireworks on the 5th of November. I think that the way to peace is for the Israelis to get real about what they are doing and what they are trying to hide from the world. The Israeli military and the Israeli government are trying to hide from the world a massive genocide that is going on at the moment in Gaza.
Your opinions, of course. William Spring, also human rights activist, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And for more updates, please visit our website, levant.tv. Thanks for watching MidEast In-Depth, and bye for now.